Volusia Flagler chapter of the ACLU's Racial Justice Series event, Reparations for African Americans, Compensatory Justice for Unjust Takings. My name is Katie Vitale, and I'm the president of the Central Florida ACLU interim chapter, and I'm filling in for Alicia Keenan this evening. The Racial Justice Series is run by our Volusia Flagler chapter. This is a monthly series, and don't forget to tune in next month for Orlando attorney Brooke Gurley from the Untold Stories podcast for a brief history of key civil rights cases. I would now like to begin with a brief summary of the ACLU. The ACLU is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We welcome everyone to join us in our constant fight to protect everyone's constitutional rights. Our only mission is to keep the promise of the Bill of Rights alive for every American. If you are already a member of the ACLU, we thank you for your membership. If you are interested in helping maintain the constitutional rights of everyone and you are not currently a member of the ACLU, we encourage you to join today. I will place a link in the chat for anyone who would like to join, and you may see this link again later as additional audience members arrive. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Eric Smaw. Dr. Smaw is a national board representative of the Florida affiliate of the ACLU. Dr. Smaw completed his PhD in legal philosophy and ethics at the University of Kentucky in 2006. Dr. Smaw is a professor of philosophy at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, where he is also the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. He continues to coach the debate team there, which he helped establish in 2007. Dr. Smaw is also a clinical ethicist at the Florida State University College of Medicine in Orlando. He has multiple publications, including but not limited to race, human rights, terrorism, international law, and medical ethics. Tonight, he will address racial inequities and economic opportunities and how reparations can help bridge the gap. So let's all welcome Dr. Smaw. Thank you, Dr. Smaw. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mrs. Vitale, for that excellent introduction. And just so that the audience members know what to expect, I'll start by talking now for a short period of time. Then I will go through a PowerPoint presentation. Towards the end, I will give some additional comments. And then after that, I'll open the floor for questions and comments. Feel free to put your questions or your comments in the chat box, and the other panelists will keep track of your questions and comments and bring them up towards the end when we do a Q&A period. Most importantly, I want this to be a democratic discussion among civic-minded individuals. So remember, democracy presumes that we will be in disagreement on various issues, and that the way we will solve those issues is through communication with one another, and then ultimately by voting our conscience. And with that, let's get started with the PowerPoint presentation. So I want to start by thanking Katie and the Volusia and Flagler County chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union of the state of Florida for inviting me as a speaker in the Racial Justice series that focuses on economic justice. Before I start my speech, I want to remind us all of something that President John Fitzgerald Kennedy once told us in 1962 at his lecture at Yale University. He said, "The great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often, we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." In this presentation, I want to challenge you to take on the discomfort of thought without a prefabricated set of interpretations on the difficult question of reparations. My name is Dr. Eric Smaw. I am a philosophy professor at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. I am a clinical ethicist at Florida State University, College of Medicine at the Orlando campus. And I am a member of the National Board of the ACLU as the representative of the state affiliate of the ACLU. And I am a member of the state board of the ACLU. I want to thank you all for coming out to this presentation, and I look forward to an engaging conversation and difficult questions afterwards. The topic of my presentation is reparations for African Americans, compensatory justice for unjust takings. There are key concepts that are necessary for understanding any conversation about justice, particularly a conversation about justice in the United States of America. First, the United States has a strong concept of retributive justice. Retributive justice is the most common kind of justice applied in the United States' criminal justice system. It involves punishment for wrongdoing. So the best example I can give you of a case of retributive justice is the punishment of the former officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Restorative justice is the least common application of justice in the United States of America. Restorative justice concerns the seeking out of truth and the attempt to reconcile the aggrieved with the person who violated or transgressed against them. The most common or the best example of restorative justice that I could give you are Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We all will remember the Truth and Reconciliation Commission established by Bishop Desmond Tutu after the fall of apartheid in South Africa. We've also had Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Rwanda after the genocides that took place in Rwanda. And so while Truth and Reconciliation is not that common in the United States, we see it applied in the international community often. Another common kind of justice that we see applied in the United States is compensatory justice. Compensatory justice concerns payments by the transgressor to the person who is aggrieved for the wrongdoing that has occurred. An example of compensatory justice that you will be familiar with is the fact that George Floyd's family received compensation from the state of Minnesota after the conviction of Derek Chauvin for having murdered George Floyd. So those are key concepts to keep in mind as I move through this presentation. And at various points throughout the presentation, I'll come back to these key concepts. Reparations are a form of compensatory justice. Reparations are paid out in many different ways. We talk and we often see reparations paid out in the form of compensation, but that's not the only way they're paid out. Sometimes reparations are paid to the descendants of the aggrieved in the form of scholarships. Sometimes reparations are paid to the aggrieved or to the descendants of the aggrieved in the form of land grants. We even see reparations paid in the form of citizenship given to the aggrieved. If you want an example of this, simply look to the case of Spain. Spain now offers citizenship to the citizens of Puerto Rico for Spain's occupation and oppression of Puerto Rico in the history of the Americas. So you should keep in mind that when I say reparations, I don't only mean monetary payments. There are many ways in which reparations have been paid out in the past, and we'll talk about them throughout the presentation also. An unjust taking, to simply put it, is a violation of a particular part of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. The Fifth Amendment, among other things, tells us that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So an unjust taking occurs when the state violates the life of another person, violates the liberty of another person, or violates the property of a person. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution tells us that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. The Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment will become crucial when I offer you constitutional justifications for reparations for African Americans. So let's get to unjust takings in the case for reparations. Since we're in the state of Florida, I thought it would be interesting and important to start with unjust takings in the state of Florida. One unjust taking I want to briefly talk about is called the Ocoee Massacre. The Ocoee Massacre occurred in between November 2nd and November 3rd in 1920. The shortest version of the story is simply this. Two African-American men, Norman and Perry, signed up and attempted to vote in the 1920 election. They were prevented from doing so, and following the prevention of them from voting, a mob of European Americans gathered in Ocoee outside of the home of July Perry. That mob was later deputized by officials of the city of Ocoee. The mob subsequently moved throughout the city of Ocoee, killing African Americans, burning the homes of African Americans, destroying the property of African Americans, and in short, running them out of town. The official records tell us that about 30 to 35 people were murdered. But Melissa Fussell, an attorney in the state of Florida, has done extensive research on the Ocoee Massacre. And one of the things she did was looked at the census at the time. The census reveals that over 500 people disappeared from Ocoee as a result of what we saw happening in 1920. Of that 500, 100 or more owned property in their homes, property in their businesses, which were destroyed or simply taken by the European Americans who executed the massacre of the African Americans. 3 years later is the Rosewood Massacre. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Rosewood Massacre because there was a 1997 film called Rosewood, which depicted what happened. In the Rosewood Massacre, the short version of the story is that an African-American male was accused of having assaulted a European-American woman. As a result, a mob gathered at Rosewood and attempted to assault, murder, threaten, destroy property and homes of African Americans. The sheriff at the time failed to disperse the mob, and the mob went on a 7-day rampage of the city of Rosewood, doing exactly what it intended to do to the African American community. Later, in February of 1923, there was a grand jury convened to prosecute the perpetrators of the Rosewood Massacre. Not surprisingly, in the United States of America, in the South in 1923, the all European American jury reached the conclusion that there was insufficient evidence to do anything to the perpetrators of the Rosewood Massacre. As a result, none of them were prosecuted. None of the African Americans received compensation at the time, but I'll talk about what happened a little bit later in my presentation. So those are examples of unjust takings that occurred in the state of Florida. But many similar unjust takings occurred throughout the United States of America. We have the Carl County Courthouse Massacre that occurred in Mississippi in 1886, the Atlanta, Georgia Race Massacre that occurred in September of 1906, the Elaine, Arkansas Race Massacre that occurred in September of the early 1920s, and the Tulsa Race Massacre that you all will be familiar with because it got a lot of press after the murder of George Floyd that occurred in 1921. These massacres are similar to what we saw happen in the Rosewood Massacre and in the Ocoee Massacre, in that there were unjust takings of property of African Americans by European Americans. There were destruction of properties by African Americans, both private homes and private businesses. There were assaults against African Americans, murders of African Americans. And in each of the cases, sometimes officials of the state actively engaged in the mayhem. And in other cases, officials of the state failed to provide equal protection of the laws. So I won't go through each of these because it'll take a long time to explain what happened in them all. But I would encourage you to look them up and do your research to look up other race massacres that occurred in the United States. You might be surprised to find out how many have actually occurred throughout the history of the early 20th century. So, are there constitutional justifications for reparations for African Americans, given the unjust takings that I just told you about? My answer to that question is undoubtedly yes. First, I pointed out to you that there were officials of the state who deputized the mob and participated in the murder and the destruction of property, and even in the theft of property in some of these unjust takings. And secondly, there were violations of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution insofar as the states in question failed to provide equal protection of the laws. There are other constitutional reasons for reparations. I'll talk about some philosophical reasons in just one moment, but these are important because of something that Katie told you at the beginning of her introduction of me. Namely, that this state has a responsibility to protect your civil liberties as found in the Bill of Rights to the United States Constitution. And organizations like the ACLU are nonprofit watchdog organizations ensuring that the state does its job. In these cases, my position is that the state failed to do its job. But then there are philosophical justifications for reparations for African Americans in the cases of unjust takings that I just told you about. The philosophical justifications include the principle of just enrichment. So the principle of just enrichment is simple. It says that you are entitled to the riches that you work for. Unjust enrichment is the riches that you gained by fraud, or the riches that you gained by theft, or the riches that you gained by murder. In the cases of the massacres that I talked to you about, we find that European Americans, some of whom worked for the state and some of whom were private citizens, engaged in unjust enrichment. That is, they inherited or stole the property of the very people who they had killed or run out of town. That is a violation of the principle of just enrichment. And then, of course, the principle of consistency requires reparations for African Americans in the case of unjust takings that I talked to you about. I say this because when we look at the history of reparations in the United States of America, we find that reparations have been paid to other groups in the United States for unjust takings. The best example I can give to you of this is of the reparations that were paid to Japanese American citizens for the property that was taken from them when they were interned by the United States government during World War II. They were later paid reparations for the internments that they suffered and the properties that they lost. So consistency would tell us that if one group of Americans, Japanese Americans, are paid reparations for the unjust takings that they suffered, then all other groups of American citizens should receive reparations if the state engages in unjust takings of their property, of their liberty, or of their lives. And then there's something called the principle of perverse incentives. You can see how, if the state refuses to provide equal protection of its laws to all of its citizens, it encourages those who would want to engage in unjust takings to do so with impunity. This is how you, or why you see organizations like domestic terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan gather up and grow themselves in numbers and then assault, murder, take property, steal, or kill African Americans because the state has done nothing to stop them and thereby created an perverse incentive. And so if you do your research on unjust takings in America, you'll find that there were many throughout the country in many different states. And part of my argument is that the state's lack of providing equal protection of its laws placed African Americans in a position of being vulnerable, and many European Americans in the position of acting with impunity. And that's where the perverse incentive was created. So there are standard objections that people articulate when a conversation about reparations arises. I'll walk through some of those standard objections and let's see where we go. So one standard objection is that, well, Dr. Smaw is simply playing partisan politics. We all know that the Democrats accept reparations and the Republicans do not accept the reparations. So I have several responses to this kind of objection. The first response to this kind of objection is that it is simply false. As I pointed out to you, Japanese Americans received reparations by something called the Civil Liberties Act. The Civil Liberties Act was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. And President Ronald Reagan is a stalwart of the Republican Party. But let's go back to what I pointed out when I had a conversation about Rosewood and Ocoee. The results of the Ocoee massacre are that the state of Florida has given a scholarship to the descendants of the Ocoee massacre. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the budget of 2020 that included money for the scholarship for the descendants of the Ocoee massacre. Governor Ron DeSantis is a Republican, and he signed a budget that included money for a scholarship for the descendants of the Ocoee massacre. And then, of course, the descendants of the Rosewood massacre received reparations in 1994. In 1994, Bill Clinton was the president at the time in which they received reparations. But There is also something called the Ocoee Family Scholarship that was signed into law in 2021 by Governor Ron DeSantis of the state of Florida. My only point here is that when you look at the history of reparations in the United States of America, you will find that both Republicans and Democrats have signed bills, laws, granting reparations to parties who have been aggrieved, particularly where the parties have suffered unjust takings. So this is not a partisan issue. Secondly, you will hear people say this is just race baiting, or this is simply special pleading for a particular race, namely African Americans. Well, my response to this is simple. First, reparations are not a race issue. Reparations are an issue of compensatory justice. They require the aggrieved to show, in the case that I'm talking about, that they have suffered unjust takings. If the aggrieved or the descendants of the aggrieved can show that they have suffered unjust takings, then they are due reparations, particularly where those unjust takings were carried out by the state or the state failed to provide equal protection of its laws. And we see many cases of that in the history of the United States. I mentioned Japanese Americans received reparations, but so have Native Americans received reparations. And so I would argue that this is neither a race issue nor a special pleading for any race. It simply says that in America, we ought to act consistently and apply compensatory justice where it is applicable to each group within the country.
Dr. Smaw, may I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
We have several questions about the slides not advancing. Are you aware that we're still on the first slide?
Not on mine. Mine, they have advanced.
You might want to check on slideshow. We're still seeing the first Volusia-Flagler chapter of the ACLU.
Okay, let me see what it looks like. Okay, can they see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so they can see my screen and the slides are moving.
Yeah, but you might want to go to slideshow because I'll show bigger.
Yes, I was on slideshow. I'm out of it now. Let's see if well, I am at the end of the presentation. So
yeah, you can click
maybe I'll see if I can get it to just play through while I finish.
Okay,
out.
that's fine.
Okay, so this is the first one. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and try to redo it again and see if it will allow the slides to simply play through. Oh, this toolbar at the end is sort of in the way. There we go. So no, it might not allow it to play through because I can't get it. Okay, well, let me finish, and when the question and answer come up, I'll see if I can troubleshoot this and get the slides to play through. Can you all see this? My slides changing?
Yeah, it's on the first slide right now.
Okay, yeah, you can't see them, Trina. Okay. Okay, and let me get to the end. Okay, so there are a few other objections you'll get to reparations. One says, well, reparations are too expensive. I'll stop sharing the screen since it's not showing you anyway. That reparations are too expensive. Well, there are multiple responses to this. The first is reparations ought to be expensive. The reason why I say this is because reparations are designed, or compensatory justice is designed to get those who are the offenders to stop the behavior of offending. One way we do this is through retributive justice, by placing a person in jail, in the state penitentiary or in the federal penitentiary. Another way we get people to stop the bad behavior is through compensatory justice. That is, by charging them fines and penalties. When the fines and penalties are sufficiently high, the behavior stops. So it's not surprising that reparations would be expensive, but reparations ought to be expensive. And then another objection you'll sometimes hear is that it's too impractical. Well, the easy response to this is America has executed programs of reparations in the past. Almost always, they start with a commission that is designed to find out what happened in the case and then make recommendations to a state legislature. They sometimes happen in court systems where a judge will rule that compensation is required. But America has multiple systems and procedures for handling claims of compensation. And then finally, your listeners may have wondered, why not have a conversation about reparations for slavery? Well, I limited this particular conversation to unjust takings simply because of the time. We might very well, at another point in history, talk about reparations for slavery. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you for listening. And I hope to have a congenial but rigorous discussion now.
Okay, we're going to begin the questions session. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the question chat, the Q&A chat area. And I'm going to go through these real quick and give Dr. Smaw some of these questions and let him answer. Okay, we do have some questions coming in. The first question is, doesn't the unjust taking justification also apply to uncompensated labor by enslavement, which would cover many more people than victims of specific massacres?
That's right. This is an excellent question. So unjust takings apply to any unjust takings. It could apply to unjust takings of property, in particular massacres, like I was talking about. But it could also apply to, say, people who are wrongfully enslaved or people who are forced into labor. So yes, unjust takings could apply more broadly than I have been using it here. And you can see why enslavement counts as an unjust taking, because a just taking is you receive the income that you work for, or you receive the property that you pay for. Those are just takings. An unjust taking would be, I receive the income that you work for, or I take the property that you have paid for. So unjust takings are effectively thefts. So any historical case of an unjust taking, in the case of slavery, for example, this argument could apply. Yes. Excellent question.
Okay, we have another question from Olive. When reparations were paid out in World War II to internment victims, was the process lengthy or was this effectuated quickly? What would the ideal process, meaning the easiest route, look like if we saw something like this in Florida or other states?
Yeah, so in the question of whether or not it was lengthy, the answer to that is yes, because it did not occur until the 1980s, but people were interned during World War II. Many of the people who were interned had died by the time the reparations bill was signed into law. And so they didn't receive reparations, but their descendants did receive reparations. And part of the reason why it took so long and why in these cases it takes a long time is because America has a long history of denying equal protection of the laws, equal access to justice to minority groups within its borders. And this was just an extension or an application of that unjust history. So it took a while. The way it happened is a reparations bill went through Congress. It was signed into law by Congress and then the president, and then it was effectuated. It doesn't have to take long, but it does. In the state of Florida, the Rosewood massacre happened in 1923, but the reparations bill for the Ocoee massacre was not signed until 1994. So you can see there were 70 years from the time in which the harm happened until the time in which the reparations were paid. The best and the most efficient way to get this done would have been if minority groups had equal access to the courts that everybody else had at the time in which the harms had occurred. But you can understand why, say in the South in the 1920s, African Americans would not have had equal access to the courts. First, there were domestic terrorist organizations around who intimidated African Americans, assaulted African Americans, and killed African Americans. So if African Americans had attempted to sue the state for reparations, they would have had to have first overcome the domestic terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But even if they could have overcome that, they would have had to have found lawyers to take up the case in 1920. Imagine a European American lawyer attempting to represent African Americans in an unjust takings claim in the 1920s in the South. So you can see why there are at least those two hurdles. First, the domestic terrorist organizations. Secondly, no European American lawyer would have wanted to take up that case. And in the 1920s, you would not have had a lot of African American lawyers to take up the case. And then third, even if they had gotten past the first two hurdles, would the court had ruled justly in their favor? We see in the case of Rosewood, when there was a grand jury convened to look at what happened and to decide to prosecute the perpetrators, the grand jury decided there was no sufficient evidence to prosecute anybody, even though newspapers had reported widely on what was going on, and the perpetrators themselves had bragged about what they had done. So, those are many reasons why you see so much time from the point at which the harm has occurred to the point in which justice is effected.
Thank you, Dr. Smaw. We have many more questions. So the next is, if reparations are not a partisan issue because Republicans and Democrats have supported them in the past, why do people confuse this as a partisan issue?
This is an excellent question, right? I mean, I imagine most people, if you were to walk around the state of Florida and ask, did Ron DeSantis sign a reparations bill? Or did Ron DeSantis sign a bill to give scholarships as a form of reparations to the descendants of the Ocoee massacre? Most people would say, no, of course not. Ron DeSantis would never do anything like that. Republicans are opposed to it. But when we look at the history of the United States, we find many Republican governors and even Republican presidents signing reparations bill and arguing in favor of just compensation for people who were who suffered wrongful and unjust takings. Well, one reason why you see this occur and Republicans don't come out openly in favor of stuff like this is because America still has a struggle with equal application of its laws to all of its citizens. People openly suggest, I'll do an analogy here. People openly suggest that harm against African Americans should not be, or harm against Asian Americans or Japanese Americans should not be addressed, while harm against European Americans should be addressed. So because America has not addressed its problem of racism and resolved all of the issues around its problem of racism, politicians realize that they, on the one hand, are required by law to do the right thing. But on the other hand, they often have large constituency groups who are racist themselves. We now see the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and many other neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan members participating in politics, and they are represented by politicians who know that they make up some of the constituency and they're worried about offending them. So they don't come out in favor of reparations in the way that other politicians who don't have that sort of constituency can. So I don't think when it comes down to it that it is a partisan issue, because justice is justice for everybody, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, whether you're European American or African American. And the United States laws are written in that way. But people are also people, and America has the history that it does. And so politicians are aware of the fact that they have a particular constituency who are not interested in equal application of American laws for everyone. And so they sometimes have to pander to that constituency.
Okay. Now we have a question from Kate. She asks, what are your thoughts on who should receive the reparations for damages?
Okay, great question. So largely speaking, I think that anybody who suffer unjust takings in the way that I described should receive reparations, whether it's Japanese Americans, Native Americans, European Americans, African Americans, or anybody else. The reason why I focus this conversation on African Americans is because when we look at the particular unjust takings that occurred in massacres, we find that race massacres of African Americans happened in many states throughout this country, and they were egregious. Large numbers of African Americans were massacred in these race massacres. Large amounts of property were stolen or damaged. And there has been no justice as a result of this. Most recently, Tulsa got a lot of attention because there was an investigation into the Tulsa race massacre, and there was unearthed a mass grave of African Americans found in the city of Tulsa. So it's gotten a lot of attention, and now the conversation is about whether or not the descendants of the Tulsa race massacre should receive reparations. So I focus this conversation on African Americans because there have been so many race massacres of African Americans where there has been no justice, either retributive justice nor compensatory justice. So that's why I focused it there. In terms of who should receive it specifically, almost always it goes to families. So most immediate living descendants, if the person who was harmed is dead, that most immediate living descendant might be a spouse, or it might be children, but almost always it goes to families.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Olive. She says, would you briefly touch on the opposition you hear when it comes to reparations for slavery? I can find responses online, but I'm curious what you hear being in an academic setting. Thank you for the great presentation.
Oh, thank you, Olive. Thank you so much. And thank you for that question. So I was talking to Katie earlier. I have multiple articles on reparations. And Katie, I think this is a good time to make the announcement. Shall I or shall you?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so if I get the details wrong, Katie, please correct me. So I have multiple articles on reparations. I will share those articles with Katie, and there's an email list of the participants in this particular meeting. So if any of you would like to read any of the articles that I've written on reparations, I will share them with Katie, and she'll be happy to share them with you. If you are not on the email list, or you think Katie does not have your email, please put your email in the chat, or make sure Katie gets your email, and then she'll make sure that you get my articles. But now let's get to the question about reparations for slavery. So here's what I say in the question about reparations for slavery, and I'll give you what I think is the most difficult objection to overcome. So the most difficult objection to overcome is that slavery was legal at the time in which it happened. Notice that the unjust takings that I talked to you about were all illegal at the time in which they happened. They happened after the passage of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and all of those apply to African Americans. Slavery, of course, occurred before the passage of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, and it was legal at the time. And so it looks like if reparations are applied for slavery, it looks like ex post facto law, that we're taking things that are illegal today and applying them backwards at a time in which they were illegal. So that's probably the best objection that I've heard to slavery. But there are multiple responses to this. So the first response to this that I often point out is that the founders realized that slavery was a crime against humanity. We had already had arguments and justifications for international human rights. They called them natural rights at the time, that applied to Africans and African Americans. We know this because in the original draft version of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson told us that slavery was a crime against humanity. Now, at the time in which he wrote that, he was criticizing the King of England. So when it came to criticizing the King of England, he clearly saw that slavery was a crime, and it was the most egregious of crimes, namely a crime against your human rights, or what they called natural rights at the time. We see the similar writings against slavery in multiple parts of the Federalist Papers, and we see this in resolutions that the founders had passed against the King of England. There's one called the resolution against the imposition of slavery in the colonies, in which they say King George imposed slavery on them where they did not want it. Okay, so the reason why this conversation is important is because human rights are most fundamental, and they're even more fundamental than, say, your constitutional rights or the state rights that you get from a country like the United States. Which means that, one, they knew this was a violation of human rights, and two, those rights are more fundamental. So there's a ground for making the claim that human rights of Africans and African Americans were violated, and the founders knew at the time that they were doing this. And then once you get there, the next question is, how do you handle the claim that slavery was legal at the time in which it happened in the United States? Well, everybody in the country is supposed to have access to the laws. And so, although it happened before the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment, Africans and African Americans wouldn't have had access to the laws. And because of that, you can what's called toll the current law, that is, move it forward at a time in which African Americans do have access to the law and try the case at that time. And then allow the court case to go through from there. So I have a address on this in my paper called Sins of the Founding Fathers. And if you would like to read that paper, I'm sure Katie will make it available to you. So my only arguments are that, well, yeah, we know the founders thought that it was a violation of human rights because they told us that. And then two, people inside the United States are supposed to have access to laws, and where they didn't have access to laws, what we do is toll those laws and bring them forward and allow the case to go forward there, because at the time in which the crime happened, they were blocked from the courts. Okay, so that's how I would respond to that. And then there's something else important about reparations for slavery that I want to talk about. In the question of reparations for slavery, should it be that everybody pays for reparations for slavery? My answer to that is that the people who should pay are the people who were engaged in harm. So when I talked about unjust takings, I talked about the particular states or the particular cities that were involved in unjust takings paying for reparations. I would say the same thing in the case of reparations for slavery. There are corporations that are in existence today that were in existence at the time of slavery and that participated in slavery. Some are corporations like Boston Fleet. Others are universities like Harvard University and Yale University. Most recently, both Harvard and Yale recognized and apologized for their participation in slavery. And Harvard just established a scholarship for African Americans because of its participation in slavery. So we see that corporations existed at the time. Some of them still exist now. They should be responsible. Or then families who owned slaves who existed at the time, who still exist now, should be responsible. So Thomas Jefferson has the Monticello Mansion, and the Monticello Mansion is the estate of Thomas Jefferson and his living children. And so the Monticello Mansion should be responsible. But I don't think people who did not participate or who did not do anything wrong should be responsible. And there are many ways that we can establish procedures for those who were responsible and are still in existence, or families that were responsible are still in existence, or states that are still in existence to pay for it. And I give a long discussion of that in my paper called Sins of the Founding Fathers. Excellent question, though.
Thank you, Dr. Smaw. Next, we hear from Roderick. He says, California just released an interim report to study and develop reparation proposals. Are you aware of any other states that have plans to study and develop the same?
Yes, this is a great question. There are many states that are having this conversation about studying reparations. And there are many different reasons why states are having the conversation and developing proposals. North Carolina and the state of Virginia, for example, the University of Virginia just uncovered its past participation in slavery, and they are discussing that is, the people in the state of Virginia are discussing what they should do about it. Should they follow Harvard and establishing a scholarship for African Americans to the University of Virginia, or should they go down the path of reparations and think about providing reparations to African Americans who are descendants of slaves in the state of Virginia? But there are other cases for reparations that are to be made. So I talk about reparations for violation of the body rights of African American women, Hispanic American women, and Native American women, because states throughout the United States engaged in a eugenics program in which they were sterilizing African American, Hispanic American, and Native American women. In fact, this was so prevalent that people called it a Mississippi appendectomy. The reason why they called it a Mississippi appendectomy is because minority women would go see their doctors, and their doctors would tell them that they need to have their appendix removed. And when they showed up to have their appendix removed, they would remove their uteruses. Here I have a paper called Uterus Collectors. In my paper called Uterus Collectors, I detail what happened, and then I make the case for reparations. So there are many cases that can be made for reparations because of the harm that's been done to people. Some slavery, some unjust taking, some infringement and violation of fundamental body rights. And then many states have started to take up this question. The state of Virginia and the state of North Carolina are taking it up. Virginia's taking it up because of what the University of Virginia discovered, but they also passed a reparations bill because of the violation of body rights of the women in Virginia. The state of North Carolina took it up because of the violation of body rights and passed a reparations bill for people living in the state of North Carolina who are the descendants of or the victims of unjust hysterectomies. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the state of California is taking it up. So to answer your question, yes, there's a lot of conversation about this, in part because America is trying to think its way through how to reconcile the aggrieved parties. So this is where I talked about truth and reconciliation. On the one hand, you have millions of African Americans who are descendants of slaves. But you also have millions of African Americans whose family lived in the South under the system of Jim Crow, where they were victims of unjust takings or body rights violations. And then you have Native Americans who suffered unjust takings of their property also. And then it sometimes happened to Hispanic Americans too. And America's been experiencing a racial reckoning over the last few years. And so you have people thinking seriously about how it is we can reconcile the different groups in the United States with one another. And reparations is just one way that they're thinking about it.
Thank you. We have a question from Carl. Could reparations begin in the United States before HR 40 and S 1083 are passed in the respective branches?
Could you repeat the question, or could we ask Carl to try to clear it up? Let me hear the question again.
Could reparations begin in the United States before HR 40 and S 1083 are passed in the respective branches?
Oh, in the respective branches of Congress. Okay, I see. The answer to that is yes. This is also a great question, because this question is about the order of the United States and how reparations might be done. So sometimes you have reparations done at a federal level, and those are the bills that Carl is referring to. the federal bills in the House and the federal bills in the Senate to investigate the question of reparations. And sometimes, and if that's done, reparations will be done by some established congressional committee. So there'd be a committee to investigate and then make recommendations to Congress. It's likely that those recommendations will include reparations for African Americans, how much, how they are to be paid out, and so on. Congress, if they were to accept that and the president signs it, you'd get a federal reparations bill. So that's one way it would happen. But reparations could also happen in the courts. Most recently, a South Dakota court gave Native Americans in South Dakota a piece of the state back. So there was a piece of the state that was originally controlled by Native Americans that was taken away from them. They sued in court, and the court determined that the Native Americans' claim was justified, and it granted back a piece of the state of South Dakota to Native Americans. So that's one way in which reparations can happen before the passages of the bills in Congress. A second way reparations could happen before the passages of those bills is if states were to have their own reparations bills. So there are many states looking into this: California, Virginia, North Carolina, and the state of Florida has already passed a few with the scholarship bills and with the reparations bill for Rosewood. So states could affect reparations at state levels before those bills pass through Congress. So the answer to your question is yes. And I think this is an excellent question because it gets us to think about how things move through the United States government. It could happen at a federal level through Congress or through a court, or it could happen at state levels through state congresses.
Okay, we have another question here. How many massacres have you identified nationwide for which survivors or families of victims should be compensated? Any estimate of the monetary amount there should be?
So there are other scholars working. I'll start with the monetary amount, then the other one, how many. There are other scholars working on the monetary amounts. So in my paper about sins of the fathers, I rely on a Jamaican scholar or a British scholar who lives in Jamaica. He's a college professor who wrote a book on reparations and talks about how much the nation of Great Britain and how much the United States of America would owe in reparations. And I remember the number being about $9 trillion. So I want to pause for a second to talk about that. So remember, as reparations are paid out, it could be a combination of payment forms: scholarships, land, money. And those payment forms don't necessarily have to happen at one time. So this is why you get people who say reparations are too expensive. The country couldn't possibly pay $9 trillion out all at one time. One of the things I talk about is establishing investment funds and then using the proceeds from investment funds to pay families. That's a way you could pay reparations without bankrupting the country, or if it were done by companies without bankrupting companies. Okay, so that's what people say about the amount of the cost of reparations. And then to the other part of your question about how many unjust takings that I've uncovered nearly 100. And I've been thinking about writing a book about unjust takings because I've uncovered so many in nearly every state in the Union. There was something called Red Summer in the United States. Red Summer is a reference to the 1920s, in which African Americans were massacred throughout many states in the country. And the reason why it was called Red Summer is because red is a reference to the flow of African American blood. So there are a lot, and they range from after the Civil War all the way up until the mid-1940s. And it's unfortunate, many of them have been lost to history because in the United States, we don't do a good job of telling our history. And so many have been lost to history, but there are many others that are easy to find. And if you do research, go to your local libraries and start digging through the archives, you'll find many of these. I'm thinking about writing a book just to make sure that the information is all collected in one place and easily accessible to people. But yeah, so far I'm near 100. of them.
Thank you, Dr. Smaw. Next question is, how would you address finding the victims? Many times family trees have been destroyed or families have been separated.
Yes, this is an excellent question. There are many problems with identifying victims. Sometimes families have been destroyed. Sometimes families are now displaced and they don't have the memory of the things that happened to their family members in the place where they originated. And sometimes families are silent and they don't want to discuss it. In fact, in Rosewood, the biggest hurdle was trying to get the victims to discuss what had happened to them. One reason why they didn't want to discuss what happened to them is because they realized that they were subject to the violence and intimidation, assaults, and even murders of local terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. So they got in the habit of simply being silent about it, even when it came to talking to their other family members. So the research would have to be extensive. When I talk about this in the paper that I wrote called Uterus Collectors, I talk about the United States federal government establishing an investigation commission. I believe that a good investigation commission would have scholars from different areas. You might need some geneticists, you might need some anthropologists, you might need some historians, some sociologists, you might need some philosophers who study human rights, and particularly Enlightenment philosophers who know the history of the Enlightenment into the development of America and the human rights, the establishment of human rights in the United States and abroad. So the reason why I talk about having a commission of many different kinds of scholars, scientists, and experts is so that they can all do the work that's necessary for uncovering who's related to whom and how these unjust takings affected families over time. So one of the things I argue is that when you have an unjust taking, you have a loss of family legacy, but also family wealth over time. We know that in the United States of America, one of the ways in which families create wealth is by leaving property to their descendants or passing on homes to their descendants. So African-American families lost the ability to pass on property to their descendants, which interrupted generational wealth. While in unjust takings, European-American families gained additional land, additional property, which increased their generational wealth, which was passed on to their descendants. So you will need scholars who can investigate and uncover how that happened. And so I think a unified commission of many different scholars and experts is the best way and the easiest way to get that done. Some of it would have to be done genetically because there has been displacement. So for example, the people who lived in Ocoee moved away. The people who lived in Tulsa, many of them moved away. And some of those people have lost their family heritage or lost family lines. So you might need people to submit their DNA to geneticists or evolutionary biologists who could trace the family line back to people who were buried in mass graves and then uncovered, where we'll have their genetic identity, but we won't have their social identity and we won't be able to connect them to other people. But one way we could do this with genetics. So I think that's an excellent question, and it's certainly a difficulty that we would have to overcome to make sure that we get exactly right who are the victims. So when you pay out reparation, it goes to those who have just claims to unjust takings.
Thank you. We have another question here from Joyce. She asks, how can reparations be made in an equal way, in a way that would best benefit all offendees? What we owe seems overwhelming.
Yes, this is a great question. Thank you, Joyce. I like this question because this is one of the questions that almost always come up, right? When you think about America, and remember, I'm just talking about African Americans. There are also claims of Native Americans, for example, to reparations. So when you think about the combination of slavery plus Jim Crow segregation, plus American eugenics, all against African Americans, it looks like it would be an impossibility to pay reparations for all of those things. So I have multiple answers to this. One of the reasons why I pick up the conversation today, at least with unjust takings, is because it's much easier to identify who lived where. We even have state records of unjust takings. But when it comes to money, so here's one way to think about it. States often collect money through taxes. And that's where people get worried, because it looks like you end up taxing everybody to pay African Americans, and you might end up taxing African Americans for reparations, or certainly European Americans who had nothing to do with it for reparations. But remember, the state is the perpetrator here, at least in the cases that I was talking about. So you might have a state take a reparations fund and invest it into the stock market. That reparations fund would gain interest over time and money over time. And then from that fund, you might pay African Americans who could establish, say, unjust takings. Or if we were talking about slavery, relationships to slaves. Or if we were talking about slaves that worked at colleges and universities, relationships to slaves who worked at those colleges and universities, and then use that fund to pay those people. The reason why I say that is because you generate income over time enough to pay people without bankrupting the country, or without bankrupting, say, the University of Virginia or the Harvard University. And we also know that the stock market has created enormous wealth for some of these colleges and universities. To give you an example of what I mean, Harvard University has $40 billion of income in its endowment, which it does not use to run the school. So Harvard runs its school off of a combination of tuition dollars that it receives from its students and other monies that it receives from other sources like property that it owns. It runs its school. But then in its endowment, it has a $40 billion endowment that simply collects money over time. Harvard might be required to use its endowment funds to pay the victims or the descendants of slavery, the slaves that it used to work at Harvard University. But the federal government could do the same thing. Establish an endowment, let the endowment grow to the Harvard level of $40 billion, and then use that endowment to pay victims so that you aren't bankrupting the country, colleges, or corporations. And then in terms of how much reparations should be paid to families, Joyce, this is a great question. I would leave that to the economists, who are probably much better than I am to answer that question. But I do know at least one person said collectively, one economist told us collectively, the amount might be something like $9 trillion. How much that'll work out to be for each family, I'm not sure. But I will point out that there are other nations, particularly in the Caribbean, who are making reparations claims to European nations that had slavery in the Caribbean. I know, for example, that Joyce is from Jamaica, and Jamaica is making the claim against Great Britain that it is owed reparations. In fact, when some of the British royals went to Jamaica most recently, they got an earful about their debt owed to the nation of Jamaica, and the debt was one about reparations. So thanks for that question. And we'll see how the British respond to the claim of reparations from Jamaica.
Okay, we have another question here from Sarah. It looks like it might be a two-part question. At the federal level, what do you think is the most attainable approach for large-scale reparation legislation? Do you believe there is an approach which could actually pass through the next several Congresses? Would a bill that could make it through the Senate anytime soon be good enough, or is it better to wait for a more significant bill?
Oh, yeah. So there's one easy part of the question. The easy part is, could it make it through this Congress? No. I mean, nothing can make it through this Congress. So we'll see. I mean, this is a pretty deadlocked Congress. And right now, America is very partisan in its approach to politics. And unfortunately, America seems to be trending on tribalism in its approach to politics. I would suggest that no reparations bill can make it through that kind of federal Congress, So we'd have to wait until the temperature of the room comes down in Congress and people can reflect and approach this more rationally and less emotively. But I do think that the best approach to reparations is one done at the federal level. The reason why I say that is because state reparations bills are limited. They're only limited to paying reparations to the people in the state who were affected by the state, while people outside of the state may have been affected by the same thing. And then sometimes with state bills, you have conflicting jurisdictions. So at the state level, you might have the state only being able to pay for reparations that where the aggrieved party was working in some state agency or on state property, while you have city property or county property where you will also have aggrieved parties, but the state reparations bill won't extend to the county or won't extend to the city. So at the state level, you have many conflicts that makes reparations sort of fraught with difficulties. While at the federal level, you can cover everybody and you can cover every person in every jurisdiction. So the jurisdictional issue, it seems to me, is easier to handle at the federal level, and the number of people throughout different states is also easier to handle at a federal level. So I think a federal reparations bill is best. I also think the reparations bill should be followed by other things that could happen at the state level, like a state apology, for example. You got apologies for the Rosewood massacre and for the Ocoee massacre. So when I say apologies, I mean official apologies from legislative organizations, Congress, at the federal level. And the third thing I would advocate for is investigations that yield information about what happened that would then be sent over to the federal archives. The reason why this is important is because you plant a marker for what's happened in the history of the United States. That marker then gives museums, colleges and universities, historians, high schools, the ability to teach what happened and tell the official story as uncovered by the state. I think it's important for us to set down these markers and then to archive the information in things like the National Archives. Or if we're talking about African Americans, you might use the African American History and Culture Museum as part of the archives, but make sure that the archiving of that information is connected with the teaching of what happened as uncovered by the state. I should point out that Ron DeSantis also signed a bill, I think it was in 2020, that made the Ocoee massacre part of the teaching of African American history. So I think not just reparations should be given, but the archiving of the information of what happened, and then the teaching of what happened for what I suspect are obvious reasons. I'm sure all of you understand why it's important to archive information and then teach the information. So thank you for that question, Sarah. It's a great one.
Next, we have a question from Donnell. Why do you think reparations have been paid out to others like Native Americans and Japanese Americans, but not African Americans, even though slavery was by far the most egregious of them all?
Yes, this is an excellent question. So by many estimations, at the end of the Civil War in 1865, there were as little as 4 million African and African American slaves in the country, and as many as 6 million African American and African slaves in the country. So you can see how massive the institution of slavery was. But after the Civil War, it looked like we were going to get progress. But that progress was interrupted by the establishment of a system of segregation and oppression called Jim Crow. And while slavery ended, racism and oppression did not end. So that continued. And that racism and oppression, of course, continued all the way up until we got the 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Bill and Voting Rights Bill. And it looked like maybe at that point in time, we could overcome and reconcile the different groups in America with one another. But then, of course, we had the war on drugs, where the war on drugs was specific and targeted at African Americans. So although Jim Crow fell, the racism and the oppression did not fall, and we ended up with mass incarceration of African Americans. So the reason why I'm telling that story is to get, to convey to you part of the reason why we find it so difficult to provide equal access of the law or equal justice to African Americans. Because in slavery, African Americans were seen as intellectually inferior to European Americans. This is where we get white supremacy. In segregation, African Americans were seen as intellectually inferior, but also degenerate. That the claims were you cannot have integration because the degeneracy of African Americans would pull the nation down. And then and by the way, I should stop here and say, when I say degeneracy, I'm referring to sexual degeneracy. Notice that in the case of Rosewood, there was a European American woman who accused an African American male of raping her. None was ever found. But then it resulted in a massacre or genocide against African Americans. Part of this comes from D.W. Griffith's book, Birth of a Nation, in which he depicts African Americans as rapists of white women. And he depicts the Ku Klux Klan as the white knights of the Ku Klux Klan, protecting the virtue of white women and keeping African Americans separated from European Americans. But then in the war on drugs, we had a similar depiction of African Americans where John DeLeo called African Americans super predators. In fact, in his book, he said, African American youth who go to school are much more likely to pack a gun than they are to pack their lunches. And so throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the country was afraid of young African-American teenage men because politicians repeated that language about African-Americans being super predators. In fact, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton participated by repeating the language of super predation by African-American men. And so the conceptualization of African-Americans as inferior, as predatory, as dangerous, all worked to create a national psyche that African Americans are undeserving. And once we got the national psyche of African Americans being undeserving, then it's less likely that people are going to push hard through the legislative branches or in the courtrooms to get justice through compensation bills that African Americans deserve because of the harms that they have suffered. By comparison, notice that you don't get the same conceptualization of Japanese Americans that you got over time of African Americans. In fact, people often refer to Asian Americans as model minorities, meaning this is how a minority should be, or this is how a minority should act. In which case, it's much easier for people to push through in our courts and congresses compensation or reparations packages for Japanese Americans because they are seen as model minorities, but not for African Americans because we have this national psyche of African Americans being degenerate, inferior, or dangerous. And so that in part is the justification for why it's so much easier for other minorities to receive reparations and so much more difficult for African Americans to receive reparations. In fact, people often become inflamed at the conversation of reparations for African Americans and apathetic at the conversation of reparations for other minorities. So thanks for the question.
Okay, Dr. Smaw, we're running late because we had such a tough time earlier.
Sure.
Do you have a couple more minutes, maybe for a couple more?
Yeah,
Okay.
this is democracy in action. And when democracy is in action, who am I to stop democracy? So
there's a lot of questions. So I'm gonna try to pick some that maybe you haven't answered already. Some of them are repetitious. So one here is, would compensatory justice be more effective in monetary form or in kind, such as with access to more socioeconomic opportunities?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So first I'm going to do an analogy and then I'll talk more specifically to the question. So notice that with everyone else, you sometimes get this. So let me start by saying you sometimes get this as an answer to compensatory justice for African Americans. You'll get, well, it's more effective to have access to social services as a way of compensating African Americans. But where it comes to everyone else, we give compensatory justice and argue that the other people should have access to social services too. So for example, Japanese Americans received reparations, but everybody thinks that Japanese Americans should have the access to social services that all other Americans should have. In other words, receiving reparations did not count as a stopgap measure for Japanese Americans accessing social services. By similar reasoning, I would say the same for African Americans. African Americans should receive reparations as compensatory justice, but also should have access to all the other social services that all other Americans have access to. The reason why I'm making this argument is because you get access to social services by virtue of being an American, not by virtue of being aggrieved or by virtue of having suffered some damages. By contrast, you get access to reparations or compensatory justice by virtue of being aggrieved or by virtue of having suffered some damages. So I think compensatory justice is meant to run parallel with access to social services. So I like the question because the question sort of references an objection that often comes up with respect to the question of reparations, and it gave me a chance to separate the two and show that they are running parallel with one another. So great question.
Okay, we've got another question here from Tiana. Which do you feel are the best ways for individuals to support slavery reparation efforts, whether in unified voice in demonstrations, outreach initiatives, politically or financially?
Great. I think the answer to the question is the combination of them. And I'm happy that you brought that up because it gives me a chance to say, often when I have these conversations, I encourage people to do your research. Don't listen to just me. The truth is, I am an expert in this area. I've done a lot of research. I've published in this area, but I'm not the only voice talking. And your voice is important too. So do your research. And following that, I want to employ you to then, after you've done your research, engage in the conversation and raise your voice. I think that everybody in this conversation has a voice and everybody in this conversation should be talking. So on some points you will agree with me, and then on other points you will disagree with me. In a functioning democracy, we adjudicate between our disagreements to come to a point at which we agree, and that's how we compromise. So I think all of them are in play, but first do your research and educate yourself. You might do it by watching films. There are excellent films about slavery and segregation in the United States of America. Selma is a film about segregation. It's an excellent film about segregation. Harriet is a film about slavery. I think it's an excellent film about slavery. And both Harriet and Selma are easily digestible for people who are just entering into the conversation. But then there are many books that you could read. There's the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. That's an excellent book to read. The autobiography of Sojourner Truth. That is also an excellent book to read. So I would say watch some films, read some books, and then go to museums. And curators in museums will be happy to walk you around and explain things to you. There's an excellent museum in Alabama called the Equal Justice Initiative Museum. It is a phenomenal museum about slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration of African Americans. And then, of course, one of my favorite museums in the country is the African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. that was recently opened. Just as a side note, I spent about 3 years trying to get a ticket to get in. I finally got a ticket to get in a few years ago, and it was well worth the experience. So I would encourage you all to go to those museums. And then after you've done those things, enter into the conversation. One of the things I like to do, so this is why I don't mind the time, I like to have democratic conversations about what the country should look like in the future with people who are civically minded. I don't like to engage in partisan tribalism where we're yelling back and forth with one another, but I most certainly love engaging with people who are civically minded and they're agreeing with me and disagreeing with me on other things about what the United States of America should do. So my answer to your question would be do all of those things. And I would push one step further and say, as you do all of those things, bring your children in, bring your nieces and nephews in, bring the other members of your family in, so that within your sphere of influence, you're having the conversation with the people who most trust, respect, and admire you. And then hopefully they'll do the same as they go out to their spheres of influence.
Thank you, Dr. Smaw. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. It looks like we're running short on time in regard to the presentation itself. So I appreciate you coming and speaking with us tonight. I apologize for the technical difficulties we had in the beginning. And I do want to let everyone know that I'm going to do my best to get the slide presentation to everyone, if that's okay, Dr. Smaw.
Yes.
So we've got a lot of emails that are coming in, and there were some additional questions. So maybe we can forward those to you or have a second session with you. That would be great too.
Yes, I'll be happy to have a second session. I thought the questions were phenomenal and I enjoyed your questions. I think you are a very astute audience and your questions were incredibly intelligent. And this is the kind of engagement that I think the United States of America needs. And so I would encourage you to have this engagement with as many people as you can. And yes, Katie, I'd be happy to do another session.
Well, Alicia will be very happy to hear that. So thank you for coming tonight. And I want to thank all of our attendees. I know it was a little bit of a rocky start, but we're still working out the kinks. So thank you so much for coming. And please don't forget to join the ACLU if you're not already a member. The link is in the chat. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.